There are moments in your life that arrive disguised as something ordinary. They wear the mask of a Tuesday afternoon, a shared cup of coffee, a casual conversation. You don't recognize their weight until much later, when you look back and see them for what they were: the subtle shifting of tectonic plates, the quiet redrawing of a map, the borders of your entire world changing while you were looking the other way. For me, that moment arrived on a Saturday night, under the obnoxious thrum of a bass line at a party I didn't want to be at, holding a warm plastic cup of something I had no intention of drinking. It arrived in the form of a possessive arm around my waist and a single, definitive word that detonated the quiet, carefully constructed world I had been living in for nearly a decade. It was a housewarming party for one of Noah's colleagues, a sprawling, minimalist space filled with people whose names were like smooth, forgettable stones. I had retreated to a corner near a large picture window, using my camera, my ever-present shield, as a reason to be separate. Through the lens, I could frame the chaos, contain it, and transform the noisy, pressing reality into a series of silent, manageable compositions. It was my job, my art, but it was also my most effective defense mechanism. I was observing a man with a truly unfortunate haircut when another man, closer to my own age, stepped into my self-imposed solitude. He was handsome in a polished, corporate way, with a smile that felt like it had been focus-grouped. He asked about my camera, then about my work, his questions a well-practiced ladder he was climbing to get to a more personal altitude. I answered politely, my responses brief, my focus deliberately drifting back to the room beyond his shoulder. I was a master of the gentle deflection, of creating an invisible wall brick by polite brick. But he was persistent. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to cut through the music, his hand gesturing with an easy confidence that I found both admirable and exhausting. He was talking about a gallery he knew, a contact he had, but the subtext was as loud as the speaker in the corner. His gaze kept dropping from my eyes to my mouth, and a familiar, weary anxiety began to prickle at the back of my neck. This was the part one always hated. The polite retreat was no longer working, and the next step was the firm, awkward shutdown that always left me feeling like the bad guy. I was preparing the words, gathering the resolve to deploy them, when a sudden warmth pressed against my back. A solid arm slid around my waist, firm and proprietary. The scent of Noah's laundry detergent, that ridiculously expensive one that smelled like sandalwood and rain, filled my senses, a familiar port in a deeply unfamiliar storm. He didn't look at me. His focus was entirely on the man who had, until a second ago, been monopolizing my personal space. Noah's chin was lifted, his expression unreadable but intense, a silent assertion of presence that was so potent it seemed to suck the air out of our immediate vicinity. The handsome stranger's smile faltered, his eyes flicking from Noah's face to the arm wrapped securely around me. He cleared his throat. "Sorry, man. Are we interrupting you?" Noah's grip tightened just slightly, a minute pressure against my hip that felt like an anchor. His voice, when it came, was low and calm, yet it carried an edge of something I had never heard from him before. It was steel wrapped in velvet. "Taken." He said it. Just the one word. Not, "He's with me." Or, "We're talking," just taken a label. A status. A fact. It landed in the space between us with the force of a gavel. The stranger's face went through a rapid series of micro-expressions: confusion, recognition, a flicker of annoyance, and finally, a sort of grudging respect. He gave a short, tight nod, muttered a "my bad," and then melted back into the crowd as if he had never been there at all. And I was left standing there, encased in the circle of Noah's arm, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The music was still loud, the party was still churning around us, but my entire universe had gone silent, compressed into that single point of contact where his hand rested on my waist, branding me with a word he had no right to use, and every right in the world. To understand the seismic impact of that one word, you have to understand the decade of silence that preceded it. You have to understand the architecture of our friendship, a structure I had painstakingly designed and maintained for 9 years. Noah and I met in college. It was a cliché born of a housing lottery error. I was an aspiring photographer, a quiet art student who communicated better through a viewfinder than with my own voice. He was the star of the university's soccer team, a whirlwind of easy charm, boundless energy, and casual confidence. On paper, we were an impossible pairing. I hoarded silence like a precious commodity. He created noise just by breathing. My side of the dorm room was a curated landscape of stacked art books, meticulously organized camera gear, and prints pinned to a corkboard. His was a glorious, chaotic explosion of cleats, jerseys, half-finished textbooks, and the lingering scent of sports tape and grass. For the first few weeks, we orbited each other like two celestial bodies with incompatible gravitational pulls. We coexisted in a state of polite, mutual bewilderment. I'd be up at dawn, slipping out of the room to catch the morning light, just as he was stumbling in after a late-night practice or a team party. He saw me as a strange, silent creature of the shadows. I saw him as a blindingly bright sun, too intense to look at directly. I was convinced it was only a matter of time before one of us requested a room change. I assumed it would be him. I was too quiet, too contained, too much of a ghost in the vibrant machine of his life. The change came, as it so often does, not with a bang, but with a quiet moment of unexpected vulnerability. It was mid-October, the air crisp with the coming cold. I was hunched over my desk, meticulously editing a set of photos from a recent shoot, the only light in the room the glow of my monitor. The door opened, and Noah came in, but without his usual boisterous energy. He didn't turn on the main light. He just dropped his backpack by the door with a heavy thud and sank onto his bed. The silence that followed was heavy and unfamiliar. I swiveled in my chair, my eyes adjusting to the dimness. He was lying on his back, one arm thrown over his eyes, his powerful athletic frame looking uncharacteristically defeated. I almost said nothing. My instinct was always to retreat, to respect the privacy of another's dark mood. But something in his posture, a deep, weary stillness, broke through my usual reticence. "You okay?" I asked. My voice sounded rusty in the quiet room. He didn't move for a long moment. I thought he might not have heard me. Then, he let out a long, shuddering breath. "Failed my midterm," he said, his voice muffled by his arm. "The physics one. Coach is going to bench me if I can't get my grade up." I didn't know anything about physics, and I certainly didn't know anything about the pressures of collegiate sports. But I knew what failure felt like. I knew the hollowed-out feeling in your chest, the shame that felt like a physical weight. I got up, walked over to my mini-fridge, and pulled out 2 beers. I opened them both and held one out to him. He finally moved, pushing himself up on his elbows and taking the bottle. Our fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, and the contact felt strangely significant, a tiny spark in the darkness. "Thanks, man," he mumbled, and he took a long swallow. We sat there for hours, in the near darkness, and he talked. He talked about the immense pressure from his coach, from his father who had also been a college athlete, from himself. He talked about the fear of not being good enough, of letting everyone down. He wasn't the charming, confident soccer star anymore. He was just a scared 19-year-old kid, overwhelmed and exhausted. And I just listened. I didn't offer solutions or platitudes. I just provided a space for his words to land. It was the first time I realized that my quietness could be a gift, a vessel for someone else's noise. By the time the sun started to hint at the horizon, the empty beer bottles were on the floor, and a new, unspoken understanding had settled between us. I was no longer just the quiet roommate. I was a safe harbor. From that night on, the dynamic shifted. The invisible line that had divided our room began to dissolve. He started asking me about my photographs, not with polite curiosity, but with genuine interest. He'd peer over my shoulder while I was editing, marveling at how I could capture a certain slant of light or a fleeting expression on a stranger's face. "You see things differently, Liam," he'd say, a note of wonder in his voice. "You see the quiet stuff." In turn, I started going to his games. I'd sit high in the bleachers, my camera with its long lens feeling like a natural extension of my arm. I wasn't watching the game, not really. I was watching him. I learned the language of his movements, the explosive power as he sprinted down the field, the incredible grace in his control of the ball, the subtle shift in his shoulders that signaled his frustration or his focus. Through my lens, I could study him without the awkwardness of direct observation. I captured the intensity in his eyes, the beads of sweat on his brow, the unadulterated joy on his face when he scored. These photographs were for me alone. They were a private study, a secret catalog of the person he was. It was during one of those games, on a blistering autumn afternoon, that I understood the true nature of my feelings. He had just scored the winning goal in the final seconds of a crucial match. The crowd erupted, a single deafening roar. His teammates mobbed him, a tangle of triumphant limbs. But for a split second, before they reached him, he looked up, not at the crowd, not at the sky, but directly at the spot in the bleachers where I always sat. I had my camera raised, the lens focused tightly on his face. And even from that distance, I saw it. A smile that was different from his public, triumphant grin. It was smaller, quieter, and it was aimed directly at me. At my camera. It was a shared moment of victory, a private acknowledgement in a stadium full of screaming fans. And in that instant, a feeling bloomed in my chest that was so powerful, so terrifyingly potent, it stole my breath. It wasn't friendship. It was something deeper, something more fragile and far more dangerous. It was love. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. It was a truth so profound and so inconvenient that my first instinct was to deny it, to shove it back down into the dark, unexamined corners of my heart. Loving Noah felt like a monumental, catastrophic mistake. He was my best friend, the first person who had ever seen my quietness not as a flaw, but as a strength. He was a fixed point in my life, a source of light and warmth. And he was, in every conceivable way, straight. He dated a succession of bright, bubbly girls who seemed like perfect complements to his own sunny disposition. To harbor feelings for him was not just pointless, it was a threat to the most important relationship in my life. A confession would be a detonation, and the fallout would destroy everything. So I made a choice. I would build a fortress around my heart. I would become the perfect friend, the unshakable confidant, the platonic ideal. I would learn to live with the quiet ache in my chest, to treat it as a chronic, manageable condition. I would channel the overflow of my affection into my photography, capturing his light from a safe distance, preserving it in silver gelatin and pixels. My love for him became a secret garden, a place I tended to in private, beautiful and lush and utterly hidden from view. I became a master of emotional architecture, constructing walls and buffers and secret passageways within myself. Our friendship was the grand, public cathedral. My love was the sealed-off crypt beneath it. And for 9 years, that structure held. It was a lonely way to live, but it was safe. The foundation was solid. Until the day it wasn't. The first crack in that foundation appeared 2 years after we graduated, on a rainy Tuesday in March. By then, our lives had settled into their own distinct rhythms. I had a small studio downtown and was slowly making a name for myself as a portrait and art photographer. Noah had taken a job as a software consultant for a big tech firm. The job paid incredibly well, but it kept him in a state of perpetual motion. He lived out of a suitcase, flying from city to city, implementing systems and training teams. He was based in our city, technically, but he was rarely there for more than a few days at a time. He had a sleek, impersonal apartment that he barely lived in, and he had Sarah. Sarah was the latest and most serious in his series of girlfriends. They had been together for almost 3 years. She was a lawyer, sharp and ambitious and beautiful. I liked her genuinely. She was kind to me and seemed to understand the unique, slightly odd intensity of my friendship with Noah. But I also saw the strain his lifestyle put on their relationship. He was a ghost in her life, a recurring visitor. They communicated mostly through screens, their relationship a patchwork of late-night video calls and brief, frantic weekends together. I watched from the sidelines, the ever-present, platonic friend, and I saw the inevitable coming long before either of them seemed to. The call came late. I was in my darkroom, the soft red light painting the small space in an infernal glow. The scent of developer fluid hung heavy in the air. My phone, set on the counter, vibrated, its screen a jarring slash of white light. It was Noah. I answered, expecting to hear the usual background noise of an airport lounge or a hotel lobby. Instead, there was just silence, punctuated by the faint, rhythmic sound of a car's windshield wipers. Liam. His voice was rough, strained. Noah? Where are you? I thought you were in Chicago until Thursday. I'm home, he said, the words sounding foreign on his tongue. I'm in my car. I'm parked outside your building. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. What's wrong? Another long pause. I could hear him take a shaky breath. It's over. With Sarah. It's done. I'm coming down, I said immediately, already wiping my hands and moving to shut down the darkroom. I found him slumped in the driver's seat of his car, the engine off, the windows fogged from the rain and his breath. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his usual vibrant energy completely extinguished. His face was pale and drawn in the sickly orange glow of the streetlights. He had driven straight from the airport to her apartment, hoping to surprise her, only to find that she had been preparing a surprise of her own. A breakup. She couldn't do the distance anymore, the constant goodbyes, the feeling of living her life on hold. She had said it all calmly, rationally, like she was presenting a legal argument, and it had shattered him. I didn't say, "I told you so," or "I saw this coming." I just opened the passenger door and said, "Come on, let's go upstairs." He followed me numbly, like he was being remotely controlled. In my apartment, he drifted into the living room and collapsed onto my sofa, the same way he had on his dorm bed all those years ago. But this was different. This wasn't the sting of a failed midterm. This was the gaping wound of a dismantled life. He had envisioned a future with her, a point on the horizon where he would finally stop traveling and build something permanent. And now that future was gone. He didn't cry, not at first. He just sat there, staring at the opposite wall, his eyes vacant. He talked in fragments, recounting the conversation with Sarah, dissecting her words, searching for a loophole that wasn't there. He was a man adrift, his anchor cut loose. His job sent him all over the country, but Sarah had been his emotional home base. Now he was just untethered. He was in his own apartment, in his own city, but he had never felt more homeless. And in his homelessness, he had come to me. My apartment, with its familiar scent of photochemicals and freshly ground coffee, with my quiet, steady presence, had become his only refuge. That night was the beginning of the shift. It was the catalyst that started a slow, inexorable chemical reaction. He was broken, and in his brokenness, he began to lean on me in a way he never had before. The carefully drawn boundaries of our friendship, the ones I had so diligently patrolled, began to blur. He was no longer just the sun I orbited. He was a collapsing star, and his gravity was pulling me in. I knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the safe, lonely structure I had built for myself was about to be tested. The foundation was cracking, and I had no idea if it would hold. I only knew that I couldn't turn him away. I had spent 9 years being his safe harbor. I didn't know how to be anything else. The ritual began subtly, born of exhaustion and convenience. Noah's job didn't slow down after the breakup. If anything, it intensified. He threw himself into his work with a frantic energy, taking on extra projects, extending his trips. It was a clear, desperate attempt to outrun his own loneliness. But the running took its toll. He would fly back into town, utterly depleted, a ghost haunting his own life. His sleek, empty apartment felt less like a home and more like a sterile hotel room he happened to have a key to. So, more often than not, he would end up at my place. It would start with a text, "Just landed. You around?" And a few hours later, he'd be on my doorstep, his travel bag slung over his shoulder, dark circles under his eyes. He'd sink into my worn leather armchair, the one that had molded itself perfectly to the shape of a human body, and a visible wave of relief would wash over him. Here, he didn't have to perform. He didn't have to be the charming consultant or the capable team leader. He could just be Noah, exhausted, grieving, and lost. My apartment, a place I had always considered my solitary sanctuary, began to feel like a shared space. His presence lingered even when he was gone. In the extra toothbrush he left in my bathroom, the scent of his cologne on the throw blanket on the sofa, the way my cat would now greet him at the door as if he were a permanent resident. The couch became the epicenter of this new, ambiguous intimacy. We fell into a pattern. He'd arrive, we'd order food, and we'd put on a movie. He was always too tired to make it through the whole thing. About halfway in, his head would start to nod. At first, he'd jerk awake, mumbling an apology, and try to rally. But eventually, he stopped fighting it. His head would drift, slowly, inevitably, until it came to rest on my shoulder. The first time it happened, my entire body went rigid. I stopped breathing. I could feel the weight of his head, the warmth of it seeping through the fabric of my shirt. I could smell the faint, clean scent of his hair. Every nerve in my body was screaming. My mind, the frantic architect of my self-preservation, was screaming at me to move, to gently dislodge him, to restore the safe, platonic distance. But I couldn't. My heart, that foolish, traitorous organ, overruled every rational thought. To have him this close, so willingly, so trustingly, was a form of exquisite torture I had secretly craved for years. So I sat there, motionless, my muscles aching with the strain of my stillness, until the movie ended and the credits rolled in silence. I listened to the sound of his soft, even breathing, a rhythm that was both deeply comforting and agonizingly painful. This was the landscape of my personal heaven and hell, the solid, trusting weight of the man I loved, asleep on my shoulder, utterly oblivious to the storm he was creating inside me. This became our routine, his arrivals, the takeout, the movie, the inevitable slide into sleep. Each time, my internal battle raged. I would analyze every detail, searching for meaning. Was the way his hand fell to rest on the cushion between us, his fingers just a centimeter from my thigh, intentional? Was the soft sigh he let out as he settled against me a sign of contentment, or just the unconscious exhalation of a deeply tired man? I was a detective investigating a crime with no evidence, a scholar studying a text written in an unknowable language. His plausible deniability was perfect. He was just tired. He was just my friend. He was just seeking comfort after a devastating breakup. Any other interpretation was a product of my own wishful thinking, my own desperate, secret hope. The ritual escalated. The couch was one thing, but then came the nights when he was too exhausted to even make it to the couch. He'd stumble in, drop his bags, and head straight for my bedroom, collapsing face down on top of my duvet. Just for a minute, he'd mumble into the pillow. So tired, and I would find him there hours later, still in his travel clothes, fast asleep. I'd gently pull off his shoes, cover him with a blanket, and then retreat to the living room, where I would try to sleep on the sofa that now felt enormous and empty. My own bed was occupied by the man who occupied my every waking thought, and the irony was so sharp it felt like a physical pain. I was an exile in my own home, displaced by the very person who made it feel complete. Then came the pretext of space. My apartment wasn't huge, but my bedroom had a queen-sized bed. One night, after a particularly grueling week of travel for him, he looked at me with eyes so full of weariness I thought he might just crumble into dust. "Liam," he said, his voice raspy. "I'm sorry, man, but I don't think I can make it to the couch. And I feel like an ass for kicking you out of your own bed. Is it? Would it be weird if I just took the other side? I promise I'll stay on my own territory." My mind went completely blank. Every alarm bell, every warning system I had so carefully installed, was screaming. This was a line. A clear, definitive line. But looking at his exhausted face, at the desperate need for simple rest etched into every feature, I couldn't say no. To refuse would be to admit that his presence in my bed meant something more to me. It would be a confession. So I gave a tight, jerky nod, my voice deserting me. "Yeah," I managed to choke out. "Sure. It's fine." It was not fine. It was the furthest thing from fine. Lying in the dark, separated by a foot of mattress that felt like a vast, charged canyon, was a torment beyond anything I had ever experienced. I lay ramrod straight, my hands clenched into fists at my sides, terrified to move, terrified to even breathe too loudly. I could feel the heat radiating from his body. I could hear every tiny shift of his weight on the mattress, every soft breath he took. He fell asleep almost instantly, his exhaustion pulling him under like a powerful current. But I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my heart a frantic drum in the echoing silence. This was proximity without contact, intimacy without consummation. It was an exercise in pure, unadulterated yearning. This, too, became part of the ritual. Not every time, but often enough that it established itself as a new, terrifyingly normal option. He would always ask, always frame it as a matter of practicality. And I would always agree, my throat tight with unspoken words. We developed an unspoken choreography. He'd take the side of the bed closer to the door, I'd take the side by the window. We'd murmur, "Good night," and turn our backs to each other, creating a fragile illusion of separation. But in the dark, the space between us was alive. It hummed with all the things we weren't saying, all the lines we were pretending hadn't been blurred. The most potent symbol of this new era was the bedroom door. In the beginning, when he would sleep in my bed, I would leave the door ajar when I finally went to the living room, a subconscious habit of not wanting to trap him, of not wanting the finality of a click. But then he started doing it. On the nights he'd go to bed first, I'd find the door not closed, but left open just a few inches. It was an invitation and a question, hanging there in the darkened hallway. It said, "The boundary is not sealed. The space is not closed off." It was the architectural embodiment of our entire relationship. A door left slightly ajar, a path not quite closed, a possibility not fully extinguished. I would stand in the hallway, my hand hovering over the knob, and my own private war would rage. To close it felt like a rejection, a reinforcement of the walls I had built. To leave it open felt like a surrender, a silent admission of my own hope. Most nights, I would just walk away, leaving it as he had left it, a silent testament to our shared, terrifying ambiguity. The ritual was complete. It was a routine of comfort and anxiety, a dance of plausible deniability. And I was so caught up in analyzing the steps that I didn't see the final, breathtaking turn coming. The crossing happened on a Thursday. It was a cold, miserable night in late November, the kind of night where the rain feels like tiny shards of ice against the window pane. Noah had been in Seattle for 10 days, a brutal trip filled with system crashes and impossible deadlines. He had been texting me throughout, his messages growing shorter and more frayed as the days wore on. When he finally showed up at my door, he looked like a soldier returning from a long and brutal war. He was hollowed out, his usual light completely dimmed. He didn't even have the energy to collapse onto the couch. He just stood in my entryway, his shoulders slumped, his luggage pooled at his feet. "Hey," he said, his voice a bare whisper. "Hey," I replied softly. "You look done." He gave a weak, humorless laugh. Done is an understatement. "I think I'm broken." He looked past me, into the warm, quiet space of my apartment, and his eyes were filled with a profound, bone-deep weariness. It was more than just physical exhaustion. It was a spiritual depletion. He looked utterly and completely lost at sea, and my apartment was the only lighthouse in sight. I took his bag from his hand and led him to the sofa. I didn't suggest a movie. I didn't even suggest food. I just sat with him in the quiet, the only sound the drumming of the rain against the glass. After a long time, he shifted, turning to face me. He didn't lie down or lean his head on my shoulder. He just sat there, looking at me, his gaze so direct and intense it felt like a physical touch. The usual mask of easygoing charm was gone. The veil of exhaustion had lifted just enough to reveal something raw and vulnerable underneath. In his eyes, I saw a reflection of my own loneliness, my own quiet desperation. The air between us, usually filled with my frantic internal monologue and his plausible deniability, was suddenly still. The tension was different. It wasn't the anxious hum of ambiguity. It was the profound, resonant silence that precedes a storm or a confession. My heart started to pound, a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff I had been carefully avoiding for 9 years. He just kept looking at me, his eyes searching my face as if he were trying to read a map in a foreign language. I could see the flicker of 1,000 different emotions in their depths: confusion, fear, exhaustion, and something else, something I was too terrified to name. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his features. The silence stretched on, pulling taut between us. I held my breath, waiting for the snap. Then, his voice, so low it was almost lost to the sound of the rain. "Liam." He said my name like it was a question, an exploration. He wet his lips, his gaze never leaving mine. "Would it be okay?" 2 words. That was it. But in the context of our 9 years of carefully constructed silence, in the charged atmosphere of that quiet living room, the question was as clear as if he had spelled it out in giant, flaming letters. "Would it be okay if I crossed this line? Would it be okay if I dismantled this fortress you've built? Would it be okay if I finally kissed you?" My entire history with him flashed before my eyes. The dorm room, the shared beers, the soccer field, the late-night talks, the years of secret pining, the couch, the shared bed, the door left ajar. It all led to this single moment, this one quiet question. All the walls I had built, all the defenses I had perfected, crumbled to dust in the face of that one, vulnerable query. He wasn't taking. He was asking. He was offering me the choice, giving me all the power. And in that moment, my fear was eclipsed by a wave of something else, something so immense and overwhelming it felt like coming home. I couldn't find my voice. The word, yes, was trapped in my throat, a butterfly unable to take flight. So I just nodded. A single, slow, deliberate movement of my head. It was the loudest thing I had ever said in my life. Relief washed over his face, a soft, beautiful dawn breaking through the exhaustion. He leaned in slowly, tentatively, giving me every possible chance to pull away. I didn't. I met him halfway. The first touch of his lips was impossibly soft, hesitant, and breathtakingly gentle. It wasn't a kiss of passion or demand. It was a question. It was a sigh of relief. It was the taste of rain and sandalwood and 9 years of unspoken words. It was a quiet, fragile thing, a secret finally spoken aloud in the dark. I closed my eyes, and a single, traitorous tear escaped and traced a path down my temple. He pulled back just a fraction of an inch, his forehead resting against mine, his breath warm on my skin. The kiss hadn't been a detonation. It had been a key, turning softly in a lock I had long forgotten was there. It was the sound of a door, not being kicked down, but being gently, finally, pushed open. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt the terrifying, exhilarating, and profound possibility of peace. The peace was fragile. It was a thin sheet of ice over a deep, turbulent ocean. The morning after the kiss was a study in absence. I woke up on the couch, a blanket tucked around me that I didn't remember pulling over myself. For a dizzying second, the memory of the night before felt like a dream, a vivid hallucination born of my own longing. But then I saw it, the indentation on the other side of the sofa, the ghost of his presence. The apartment was silent. Too silent. A quick check of my bedroom confirmed it. He was gone. His travel bag, which had been slumped by the door, had vanished. My heart, which had felt so full and light just hours before, plummeted. My phone was on the kitchen counter. A single new message. It was from him, sent at 5:30 in the morning. Hey, sorry, had to grab an early flight to Boston I forgot about. Crazy week. We'll talk later. I read the message 5 times, then 10. Each word was a small, sharp stone. Crazy week. We'll talk later. It was the kind of text you send to a colleague, not to the person you just shared a life-altering kiss with. There was no mention of what had happened, no acknowledgement of the monumental shift. It was a deflection, a sidestep, a retreat into the safe, familiar territory of his chaotic work life. The hope that had bloomed so brightly in my chest began to wither, its petals curling in on themselves. I felt like a fool, a naive, hopeful idiot who had mistaken a moment of exhausted, post-breakup confusion for something real. He hadn't been asking for permission to start something. He had been seeking a momentary solace, a human connection he could discard as easily as a boarding pass. The promised talk never came. Later became a vague, undefined point in a future that seemed to be constantly receding. He was in Boston, then he was in Atlanta. His texts were sporadic, brief, and relentlessly professional. Hope you're having a good week. Client meeting went well. This project is a killer. He was building a wall between us, brick by cheerful, impersonal brick. He was retreating behind the very plausible deniability I had once found so agonizing. Now, it was just cruel. I tried to reply in kind, to match his breezy tone, but my own messages felt heavy and brittle in my thumbs. Each tap of the screen was a reminder of the chasm that had opened between us. The silence about the kiss was deafening. It was a black hole, sucking all the air and light out of our friendship. The days stretched into a week, then 2. The ache in my chest settled into a dull, constant throb. I felt hollowed out, haunted by the ghost of a possibility. I went through the motions of my life, meeting with clients, spending hours in the darkroom, editing photos, but everything felt muted, desaturated. I found myself unable to look at the photos I had taken of him over the years. They felt like relics from a different life, evidence of a love that had only ever existed in my own head. The fortress I had built around my heart hadn't just been breached. It had been ransacked, and I was left standing in the ruins, wondering how I could have been so wrong. My quietness, which he had once called a gift, now felt like a curse. I had been so used to living in silence that I had forgotten how to demand to be heard. He finally came back to town on a Friday night, almost 3 weeks after the kiss. He sent a text that was so jarringly normal it felt like a form of gaslighting. Landed. Starving. Pizza at your place? My first instinct was to say no, to make an excuse, to protect what little was left of my sanity. But my second instinct, the one that had governed my life for a decade, was stronger. I needed to see him. I needed to look him in the eye and understand. I needed this agonizing ambiguity to end, one way or another. Sure, I texted back. When he arrived, he was the picture of practiced normalcy. He was carrying a pizza box and a 6-pack of beer, a peace offering for a war he refused to acknowledge had been declared. He smiled a little too brightly and talked a little too quickly about the nightmare logistics of his Boston trip. He was filling the air with noise, with meaningless chatter, leaving no room for the heavy silence that was waiting to descend. I played along, my responses monosyllabic, my body tense. We sat at my small kitchen table, the pizza box a barricade between us. He ate with a hearty appetite, recounting anecdotes about his colleagues, while I just pushed a piece of crust around my plate, the food tasteless in my mouth. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. The pretense was choking me. I put my crust down and looked at him, really looked at him. He must have felt the shift in my gaze, because his story faltered. He trailed off mid-sentence, the forced cheerfulness draining from his face. He looked down at his plate, suddenly unable to meet my eyes. "Noah," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "What are we doing?" He didn't pretend not to understand. He just shook his head, a small, defeated gesture. "I don't know, Liam. You kissed me," I said, putting the fact on the table between us like a piece of evidence. "And then you disappeared. You acted like it never happened. You have to know how that felt." He winced, the words landing like physical blows. "I know," he whispered. "I'm sorry. I freaked out. You freaked out." The frustration and hurt that had been simmering for weeks finally boiled over. "So you just run? You leave a stupid text and then ignore me for 3 weeks? After 9 years, is that what I get? Is that what our friendship is worth to you?" "No, of course not," he said, finally looking up, his eyes wide with distress. "It's because of our friendship that I freaked out. It's everything. Liam, my whole life has been a straight line. School, soccer, job, girlfriend. It's all I've ever known. And then, with Sarah, that line broke. And I was lost. And you were there. You were the only thing that felt solid." He took a deep, shaky breath, struggling to find the words. "Lying on your couch, in your bed, it was the only time I felt safe. Like I was home. And I didn't understand it. And then that night, I looked at you, and it just hit me. All at once. It wasn't just about feeling safe. It was about you. It's always been about you, I think, in a way I was too stupid or too scared to see." He dropped his head into his hands, his voice muffled. "And so I kissed you. And it was the most right thing I think I've ever done. And it terrified me, because I didn't know what it meant. For me, for you, for us. I felt like I had just thrown a bomb into the one good thing I had left in my life. So I ran. It was cowardly, and it was selfish, and I am so sorry, Liam. I hurt you. I panicked because I finally got something I didn't even know I was allowed to want, and I didn't know what to do with it." His confession hung in the air, raw and honest and painful. All the anger drained out of me, replaced by a deep, aching empathy. He hadn't been discarding me. He had been terrified. His confident, easygoing exterior was just another kind of fortress, and the kiss had breached his walls just as it had breached mine. He was just as lost as I was. He had looked at the wreckage and, instead of trying to rebuild, he had fled the scene. I reached across the table and gently touched his arm. He flinched, then relaxed into the contact, leaning into it like he was starved for it. He lifted his head, and I could see tears glistening in his eyes. He looked young and scared and utterly overwhelmed. "So what now?" I asked softly. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of hope and fear. "I don't want to run anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I don't know how to walk. Can we just figure it out? Together." It wasn't a perfect, storybook declaration. It was messy and uncertain and full of fear. But it was real. It was the honest, terrified truth. And it was more than enough. I gave him a small, watery smile. Okay, I said. Together. And so we began to rebuild. Not the old structure, the cathedral with the secret crypt. Something new. Something built on the messy, uncertain, but honest ground of his confession. We started over, not as friends, but as something undefined, something we were learning the shape of day by day. Which brings me back to the party, to the arm around my waist, to the single word that echoed in the space between us. That night was a few months after our conversation over the cold pizza. We were still in the delicate process of figuring it out. We were learning a new language, a new choreography. The cuddling on the couch was no longer a question. It was a given. His head on my shoulder felt like a birthright. We held hands in the privacy of my apartment, a simple act that felt revolutionary. But we hadn't taken it public. We hadn't put a label on it, not even to ourselves. We were living in a quiet, fragile bubble of our own making. So when that man at the party had cornered me, I had defaulted to my old programming. Deflect, retreat, manage. I didn't think to look for Noah, to use him as a shield. Our us was still too new, too private. I hadn't yet learned that I was allowed to lean on him in that way. And then he had appeared, a silent force, his presence a sudden and undeniable fact. As he stood there, his arm a solid band of warmth and possession around me, I watched his face. I saw the flicker of irritation as he observed the stranger's persistence, the subtle tightening of his jaw. It wasn't the jealous rage of a stereotypical alpha male. It was something quieter, deeper. It was a protective instinct, a sudden, clear drawing of a boundary around what was his. And then he said it. Taken. The word was for the stranger, but it was also for me. It was a declaration. It was the answer to all the unspoken questions that still lingered between us. It wasn't a brand of ownership. It was a statement of fact, a public confirmation of the private truth we had been carefully nurturing. It was Noah, the man who had run from a single, private kiss, now claiming me in a room full of people. It was him, finally, not just walking, but planting his feet. He was done being afraid. He was done with ambiguity. After the stranger retreated, Noah didn't let go. He turned me slightly, his hand sliding from my waist to the small of my back, his other hand coming up to cup my jaw. He ignored the party, the people, the noise. He created a world that consisted only of the two of us. You okay? He asked, his voice low and concerned. All the steel gone, replaced by that familiar, gentle warmth. I could only nod, my throat thick. A small, wry smile touched his lips. Sorry, that was a little primitive. No, I managed to whisper. It was clear. His smile widened. The look in his eyes was open and certain, free of the fear and confusion that had haunted him for so long. Good, he said. I'm tired of things being unclear. He leaned in, right there in the middle of the crowded room, and gave me a soft, brief kiss. It wasn't a secret. It wasn't a question. It was a period at the end of a sentence. It was a statement. This is us. We didn't stay at the party much longer. We left together, walking out into the cool night air, his hand finding mine, our fingers lacing together in a way that felt both new and anciently familiar. Back at my apartment, our apartment, as it was slowly becoming, the quiet felt different. It was no longer a space filled with tension or unspoken longing. It was a comfortable, settled silence. A silence that was full, not empty. He went to my bedroom, and, for the first time, I followed without hesitation. The door, which had for so long been a symbol of our uncertainty, was closed behind us, sealing us in our shared space. There was no more territory to negotiate, no more invisible lines. There was only the quiet certainty of being exactly where we were supposed to be. Some homes, I've learned, are not four walls and a roof. Some homes are a person. They are the steady presence that anchors you in a storm, the safe harbor where you can be your most broken and your most whole self. Finding that home is a rare and precious thing. But the truly miraculous part is not just finding it. It's learning that you are allowed to live there. It's the slow, terrifying, and beautiful process of dismantling the fortresses you've built, of stepping past the door you left ajar, and of finally believing the quiet truth that has been waiting for you all along. That night, lying in the dark, with Noah's arm draped over my chest and his steady breathing a lullaby in my ear, I finally understood. The silence wasn't a void to be filled or a space to be feared. We had learned to build a life within it. And in the beautiful, honest quiet we had created together, we were finally, truly, home.